My ex-stepfather, a man I refuse to associate with beyond the unfortunate fact that he married my mother, is one of the worst people I've ever known. My mother, in her misguided attempt to give me a father figure, chose him despite all the red flags. He wasn't just toxic, he was verbally abusive, manipulative, and self-serving. When they divorced, I thought I'd finally be free of him, but he insisted on forcing his way into my life. Every other weekend, I was dragged to see him and his new wife, despite my protests and discomfort. By the time I ended up in foster care, I'd cut him out of my life entirely. I didn't check up on him, didn't ask if he was alive, and certainly didn't care to. Moving away from that city felt like escaping a prison. So when I moved back in 2008, I was genuinely surprised to find out he was still alive and, worse, still in town. By then, I had rebuilt my life. After years of hard work, I had finally saved enough to buy my first car, a 1992 Buick Regal Custom. That car was my pride and joy. It wasn't just transportation, it was freedom. I also loved helping others, and my car made it easier to do so. I volunteered at a local homeless shelter, running errands, giving rides, and doing whatever I could to assist people in need. Unfortunately, the shelter is where our lives intersected again. My ex-stepfather had become a resident there. At first, I avoided him, pretending he didn't exist. But he noticed me, and worse, he noticed my car. Through my volunteer work, I befriended two young men staying at the shelter. They had fallen on hard times and were working odd jobs to save enough money to return to their hometown, the same town I had lived in during foster care. When they told me their plan to take a Greyhound bus, I offered to drive them instead. It would save them about $250, and I only asked for $40 in gas money. They were thrilled, and we made arrangements for their departure. But my ex-stepfather overheard our plans. What he did next was disgusting, infuriating, and would set in motion a chain of events that changed everything. The night before I was scheduled to drive the two young men to their hometown, my ex-stepfather cornered them in the shelter's shower area. He made vile threats, telling them that if they didn't submit to him sexually, I would demand the same kind of payment when I drove them. When they resisted, he threatened to kill them. Terrified, they agreed, feeling like they had no other choice. When I arrived at the shelter the next morning to pick them up, the atmosphere was tense. Yesterday, they had been eager and excited to leave the city behind, but now they looked anxious, like they were walking into a trap. They approached my car hesitantly, treating it as though it might explode. Sensing something was off, I asked them what was wrong. At first, they avoided the question, saying they weren't sure about leaving anymore. I reassured them that it was fine and reminded them that the Greyhound bus wouldn't take them to their destination anyway. Reluctantly, they loaded their belongings into my trunk and climbed into the car. The tension in the air was suffocating. As we drove, they were quiet, barely speaking to each other or to me. Finally, after we crossed into the next state, they asked me to drop them off at a hotel. They said they'd figure out another way to reach their hometown. Confused, I pulled over and pressed them for answers. I told them I didn't mind dropping them off if that's what they really wanted, but I needed to know why they had changed their minds. After a moment of silence, one of them broke down in tears, choking out the story of what my ex-stepfather had done the night before. Hearing their account made my blood boil. The man I had tried to forget, the one who had ruined so much of my life, was still finding ways to hurt others. The thought of what he had threatened and what he had tried to pin on me filled me with a fury I hadn't felt in years. I pulled back onto the road, assuring the two men that they were safe with me and that I would never do anything like what my ex-stepfather had implied. They reluctantly agreed to let me take them the rest of the way, and I spent the remainder of the drive calming their fears. I urged them to file assault charges against him and to provide DNA evidence to the police if they could. They promised they would. On the way back, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I needed to do something, not just for these two men but for everyone my ex-stepfather had likely hurt over the years. That's when I remembered something important. My ex-stepfather was a registered sex offender. Years ago, he had told me a story about being caught urinating on an elementary school playground when he was 16. Whether that was the whole truth or just part of it, he had to register as a sex offender, which had caused significant problems for my mother when she married him. It was one of the reasons I ended up in foster care. Child endangerment laws didn't allow him to live in the same home as me. What I also knew was that he hadn't registered in our state for years. If the shelter knew he was a registered sex offender, they would have evicted him immediately, as they served meals to families with children and had programs for youth. I had my plan. The moment I got back to the city, I headed straight to the admissions office at the shelter. I informed the staff that they had a registered sex offender staying with them who hadn't updated his registration for years. I made it clear that if they didn't take action, I would report the shelter to the police and expose them for endangering the children and families they served. The shelter had a safe space designation for children and even ran youth programs, so my warning struck a nerve. The staff acted immediately. Within hours, they tried to locate my ex-stepfather to evict him, but he had already caught wind of the situation and vanished. He left without a trace, disappearing from the shelter and the city entirely. I thought that was the end of it, but a few weeks later I learned he hadn't just fled the city, he'd fled the state. A smarter person might have researched what leaving a state without updating sex offender registration entails. My ex-stepfather didn't. His decision to cross state lines without notifying law enforcement had turned a misdemeanor into a federal crime. Not only had he failed to register in our state, but he also hadn't registered in the 9 states he passed through on his way to his hometown. Each state added another felony charge to his record. Months passed, and I thought I'd heard the last of him. Then, about 3 months ago, I received a Facebook message from the 2 men I had helped. They told me their case against my ex-stepfather was progressing and that law enforcement was looking for him. They asked for my phone number, and within minutes of sharing it, I received a call from a county sheriff working with a federal agent. The sheriff asked if I knew where my ex-stepfather was. As I explained that I hadn't seen him since his disappearance, a new Facebook notification popped up. It was a message from his wife. Her words made me physically gag. "Please give my husband a chance to reconcile with you." Curious, I clicked on her profile and began scrolling. Within minutes, I discovered their location. They had moved back to his hometown, 9 states away, and were living next door to the very elementary school where he'd first been caught all those years ago. It was an unbelievable level of stupidity. I relayed this information to the sheriff and the federal agent. They were stunned but immediately began coordinating with local law enforcement in his hometown. The charges against him were staggering. In addition to the statutory assault charges filed by the 2 men I had helped, he now faced multiple felony evasion charges for failing to register in every state he'd passed through. The sheriff informed me that the day he fled our city, he'd sealed his fate. Within a week, he was arrested. The sheer weight of the charges ensured he wouldn't see freedom again anytime soon. Hearing that my ex-stepfather was finally in custody brought a sense of justice I hadn't thought possible. For years, this man had inflicted pain on everyone around him, manipulating, threatening, and tearing lives apart. Now, his actions had caught up with him in the most fitting way. The final charges against him were staggering. He faced 2 counts of statutory assault from the 2 men he had threatened, 3 counts of felony evasion for failing to register across state lines, and several other charges tied to his previous crimes. Altogether, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with no chance for parole for at least 17 years. I later learned that when authorities arrested him, he tried to lie his way out of it, claiming ignorance about the registration laws. But it didn't work. The fact that he had knowingly fled the shelter and crossed multiple state lines was all the proof they needed of his intent to evade justice. For me, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about stopping a man who had hurt so many people from continuing his reign of terror. Knowing that he would no longer be able to harm anyone else, whether through manipulation, threats, or worse, gave me a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. The 2 men I had helped messaged me after his sentencing to thank me for standing by them and helping bring my ex-stepfather to justice. Their lives had been deeply impacted by his threats, but they were healing, knowing he was finally where he belonged. As for me, I've moved on. I've built a life filled with kindness and compassion, helping others as I can and finding peace in knowing that I didn't let my past define me. My ex-stepfather thought he could escape accountability, but in the end, his own choices sealed his fate. For more stories of resilience and justice, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let's share, learn, and grow together.